Three, two, one. Test 1, 2, 3. Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to Automation Management for Home Flight Simmers. My name is Evan. You may know me as the co-founder of Flight Simulation Association. I am also an active VATSIM controller. In fact, I was just on Boston Approach a couple minutes ago. Boston has been busy all day today. I think the release of that new Flight Tampa Boston for MSFS is making people really have an extra reason to come and visit us over at Boston. And alongside me today, we have Krikor. Krikor, you and I have been talking all day, but hello, how are you? Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too, Evan. I'm well. How are you?
I'm great. So Krikor is going to introduce himself a little bit more in a few moments, but he's a CFII airline pilot and a VATSIM controller. He's done a little bit more of VATSIM than I have. I focus mostly in the Boston area. He's visited a couple of other places, so he has a bit more network experience than I do. And I found out that today is actually World Pilots Day as well. So apparently we managed to pick this live stream on the perfect day to celebrate aviation and pilots around the world. And both of us, as you may know, are airline pilots. We're both big VATSIM people, and we're both very much supporters of this type of content, really trying to reach out. VATSIM's Board of Governors for quite a while now has been talking about doing more education, more outreach, making it a little bit easier for pilots to comprehend some of the complicated processes, tasks, items, procedures that we're seeing on the network every day. And so we're happy to play a small role in that here at Flight Simulation Association by putting on webinars just like this one. You may have joined us when David and Rob took us through some cross the pond briefing stuff, and this will be in a similar type theme, looking at some of that educational content around how we can better use automation, when it's the right time to hand fly, and perhaps when it's better to have everything fully engaged. Now, all of our content today is focused on North America. Both of us fly in Canada and the United States regularly. That doesn't mean that it won't be relevant for Europe or other parts of the world. Of course, this content is generally pretty applicable no matter where you are, but our examples are going to be a little bit more North American focused. So if you haven't been flying in North America recently, good opportunity to learn some stuff. And if you are someone who's a European pilot, you tend to fly in other parts of the world, maybe we can do something like this that's a little bit more focused on those other regions at some point in the future. Now, we're live on a whole bunch of different places on Flight Simulation Association, on VATSIM's website, YouTube, and Twitch. We're live on VATUSA with the Pilot Club. Shout out to Paul and the Pilot Club. Thanks, guys, for the support. And we're also, you could be listening live on Sky Blue Radio tonight as well. So because of the fact that there's so many different places to watch this, if you have questions, I'll tell you where the best places are to send those in. Firstly, the easiest place for me when you have a question is through the Flight Sim Association website. So if you have a free account or if you're an FSA captain, and a big thank you to you for the support, you can ask your questions directly through the Flight Sim Association website. Those come directly to me, so that makes my life really easy. I will also try my best to monitor all the different chats. So if you have a question, post it wherever you're watching. We have some moderators on that are going to help filter some of those questions through. And if you have a question for us, pop it in the chat wherever you are, and we will do our best to get to those. Krikor will talk for about the first sort of 40-45 minutes, and I'll try my best not to be too interrupting, and then we'll go through questions at the end of today's session. And as always, if you like this content, if you appreciate the work that we're doing here at Flight Simulation Association, I invite you to come and sign up. It's a free account that you can create at flightsimassociation.com. You also have the option to subscribe to become an FSA captain. That costs you $3 a month, helps us support webinars just like this one. You also get access to discounts and preferred pricing from more than 40 different flights and vendors, including Fly Tampa, so you can save 10% on that new scenery I mentioned a few minutes ago, and access to our show, special perks when you come out to Flight Sim Expo, and all kinds of other good stuff. So hello to the FSA captains, Will, Eric, Brom, and Ralston Consulting Incorporated, which I guess, I don't know who you are, but thank you, welcome, thanks for being here, and everyone else who's joining us on YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook Live. Great to see you all tonight. So with that in mind, let me send things over to Krikor. And Krikor, I'll let you take us through this topic that means a lot to me, means a lot to you, I know as well. And I'll be here to interact with you and ask some questions as we go.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Evan. Like you said, my name's Krikor. I go by Kiki as well, which I picked up in college and eventually just gave into. But yeah, I'm really excited to bring this to you guys. And this is something that I'm very passionate about. It's something that's really, really important to us, both in our professional lives and also on VATSIM and doing stuff on the side. So I want to preface this with this is an extremely complicated topic, and there's really no way to fully get into it in an hour. So, my goal here tonight is really to help start a conversation and lead to a shift in learning and trying to understand kind of some of the background processes that these automated systems are doing. So, really, we're only scratching the surface tonight. on what we're talking about. A lot of the screenshots you guys will see tonight, I got from the very well done Hot Start Challenger for X-Plane, mostly because it's the closest systems-wise to the CRJ that I fly at work, and so I was able to get into a lot of its systems better. But a lot of these concepts apply to any airplane with small variations. So Evan, please chime in with information from the airplanes you've flown, and let's have some conversation about it.
Sounds good.
So like Evan said, a little bit about me, Creekor, Kiki, whatever. It's hey you, I kind of go by whatever, but I'm a first officer at a regional airline here in the US. I have an ATP license with type ratings for the CL65, which is the CRJ family of airplanes, as well as the DC3, which is a little bit different and a little bit less automated. And I've been a part of BVA since 14, back when I was in high school, so kind of been around the block a little bit. As far as what we'll cover today, there's a couple different things, and it's not strictly in this order, but we're going to talk about levels of automation, when you want more automation, when you want less automation, um, and some thoughts about that. We'll talk about the process of automation, the different components of flight directors, autopilots, flight mode enunciators, and other components that you may not be as familiar with. We'll look at a couple specific examples of places where automation is great, but you need to kind of watch it and make sure it's doing the right thing, a couple tips and tricks, and at the end, we'll hopefully have some good questions and be able to continue this discussion and keep everything going. So why is this important? Why is automation so critical? So here we have two photos, and some of you may recognize these, some fairly high-profile accidents. On the top, we have Asiana 214 from a couple of years ago in San Francisco, and the bottom, Air France 447 from 2008, I want to say. And both of these accidents, automation played a pretty significant role in the final outcome, or in some cases, the lack of automation or the lack of understanding of automation. These are pretty dramatic. For most at-home simmers, obviously the consequences are maybe just a little bit of embarrassment and a quick disconnect from VATSIM. But the point is that even in real life, it's a really, really critical topic, and it's one that we're still learning about. I mean, I'm sure, Evan, you can speak the same, but when I'm at work, I'm constantly learning new automated features of the airplanes, or even little details about how the airplane automation functions and little kind of quirks it has, or potential catches that you have to look out for.
For sure.
So that's why it's so important to me. Again, a little bit dramatic, but you get the idea. So let's get into the first big concept, which is garbage in, garbage out. Now, Evan, you can speak to this as well, but generally speaking, automation is only as good as the information that you supply it with. It's very, very literal. It's never going to understand what you're thinking. It's never going to infer. It's never going to help you unless you tell it exactly what you want. And so the first of a few examples that we're going to talk about here in just a minute specifically addresses making sure that everything is set up correctly so that the automation can do its job. Later on, I have an example of a real life scenario that I had when I was new and still kind of transitioning to flying the CRJ, of a very, very small error that I made that contributed to a loss of situational awareness because the automation worked the way it was programmed, but I gave it bad information. So you'll hear all the time, especially in the airline environment, garbage in, garbage out. If you give the airplane bad information, it's going to give you bad automation. And that's why it's really critical that you not only understand how the airplane functions, but make sure you're putting in good information in the first place. So let's talk a little bit about the levels of automation. Now, it's actually funny. I've thought of automation levels in terms of a range, a scale, if you will, of more automation and less automation. But I wasn't aware of a strict 4-level system that existed, that had already been developed. And so when Evan came to me and we initially started talking about doing this presentation, he messaged me and he was like, "Hey, we can include things like the levels of automation." And I'm like, "Yeah, sure, that sounds great." And immediately went and Googled what those levels are. But it's actually really good information to have, and I found this really interesting. So here we have a brief description of the 4 levels of automation, and they go essentially from the least to the most automation. So level 1 is manual flight with no flight director. So you're flying the airplane, essentially raw data is the common aviation phrase, but there's no automated system telling you exactly where to point the nose of the airplane to make something happen. Level 2 is manual flight with a flight director, and then either an FGS or an FMS, a flight management system, something telling you where to go to help you navigate along a lateral track. So you're still flying the airplane, but now you have the flight director providing input and kind of guiding you as far as how to maneuver the airplane to accomplish your desired outcome. Level 3 has the autopilot and the auto throttle if you have it in FGS modes or flight guidance systems. So that could be a heading mode, a vertical speed mode, but you're still telling the autopilot very specifically what to do with the airplane. The difference with that and level 4 is level 4, it's following the FMS. So you've pre programmed a route or a lateral track, and the autopilot is following that. It's making turns and possibly climbs and descents without any human input. So it's a huge range, and there are different times when both, or rather, both extremes of these modes may be useful. So whether you're watching or you're listening, whatever platform you're on, put in the chat some thoughts. When do you think level 4 would be the ideal mode? That is to say, the most automation. So the autopilot, the auto throttle if the airplane has it, and then either the FMS, or excuse me, the FMS as equipped. When would be some scenarios or some times when that may be the ideal mode to be in?
Yeah, let's
And then
let's get
Evan,
the
if you
audience perfect. Yeah, let's get the audience engaged. Hopefully you're watching, paying attention. I know there's going to be some questions coming through in the next few minutes, but now is a good time to tell us the answers. So if you've heard Krikor or Kiki explain the difference between these four levels of automation, and by the way, if you haven't seen this before, this is something that it typically is included in a lot of the beginning airline training. You'll find this in a lot of the manuals from airliners. They talk about different levels of automation just like this. So tell us what you think level 4 would be good for. So Eric, FSA Captain, says cruising at altitude. That's a good example. David Celestic on the VATSIM Discord, I'm sorry, I should say Twitch, says in cruise as well. Flying is repetitive. Same for the whole flight. Doge, hi Doge, says cruise as well. Another example between taking off and landing. VATSIM Net says during oceanic flight. I like that. So yeah, we're talking about for that level 4 sort of full automation. Most likely it's going to be at a time when workload is probably lower. We maybe have other tasks going on. Gary, FSA Captain, says longer trips, maybe when you're in some weather, so you don't want to be busy trying to deal with hand flying the airplane while you're flying through clouds, or you're maybe dealing with some sort of a deviation for weather. That's a good example. Matt, FSA Captain, says on Unicom at cruise, another good example. Lots of good examples coming through, Krikor. Someone else
yeah.
on the VATSIM Twitch goes 97.92% of the time.
Yeah, no, those are really good examples, and a lot of them there's a little bit of similarities between them, right? So there's a lot of low workload environments at cruise, the initial descent, times when you're not doing a whole lot, um, and then I don't remember who it was who said it, but deviating around weather or using it as a tool to reduce workload, and that's a really good point as well because automation can be a tremendous help in reducing workload, especially when you're busy looking at weather or planning a diversion or something like that. So that's a really good example as well.
One more on
Um,
level 4 that I think might just be interesting to talk about off of the Flight Sim Association YouTube. Bad Luck 95 says, what about on a SID or a STAR, especially in RNAV procedure? Is that a good time for level 4?
that's a good question. The answer is kind of it can be. If everything is set up and programmed properly, it is. The only downside, or not downside, may not be the right word, but the only thing or the catch is you have to make sure it's programmed correctly, and that's something we're specifically going to address here in a minute. Um, so generally speaking, it can be, yeah, but only as good as everything is set up, which kind of goes back to that garbage in, garbage out. And Evan, you can elaborate a little bit as well.
Yeah, no, I think you hit it on the head for sure. So you want to talk about level 1?
Yeah, let's do the same thing. So put in the chat some thoughts. When do you think level 1 would be the desired mode? That is, the least level of automation.
And I cheated a little bit and I asked some people to pre-answer this question so that we wouldn't have a delay when we get the answer. So that was good. Thanks to the Pilot Club and Paul for doing this. And they're having a chat in their Discord as well as watching this on YouTube with us. So a couple answers from them on level 1, probably a fairly obvious one, but landing, unless we're
Yeah.
actually doing an auto land, we're definitely going to have the autopilot off. We might have the flight director on maybe, depending on the type of landing that we're doing and what kind of airplane. FSA Captain Eric says base training. I think maybe that's talking about maybe being in the pattern, for example. That would be a good example for sure. Will says a quick emergency response is needed. So maybe the airplane isn't doing what we wanted it to do. Maybe we have a TCAS RA. We're going to basically turn
Yeah.
everything off, just do it ourselves. FSA Captain Brad says maybe a failure of an aircraft system. So maybe the flight director's failed and we don't want that on. Maybe we've got to do some VFR flying. That'd be a good example. Philly says when flying an ATC gives you a specific heading, or you're flying VFR, so you're not necessarily going to be following a particular navigation. Viper Strike, kind of echoing a point earlier, when the automation systems fail to work properly. Greek, or maybe you want to talk about that one because that's huge.
Yeah, that's a really, really good one. And especially the difference between level 2 and level 1, right? That is the flight director. So manual flight and eliminating the flight director. And that's a perfect example of when you'd want to do that. If the flight director is telling you to turn right, but ATC is telling you to turn left, clearly the automation somewhere has failed. Um, and getting rid of that flight director and just reducing it down to level 1 and having that manual flight eliminates that conflicting information, which may on the surface not seem like that big of a deal. But when you start to get task saturated, people tend to fall back on habits, right? And the habit that is beaten into airline pilots through training is to fly the flight director. So removing that conflicting information is a huge help when you're starting to get task saturated and the automation just isn't working. So that's a really, really good example of a time that you'd want to disconnect the autopilot, the flight director. And that's something we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, a couple
Uh,
of examples we have.
on the VATSIM YouTube, Christian, I don't know if this is for level 1 or level 4, but Christian says when you pour yourself a drink and you don't want that whiskey to spill. That was their answer. So I don't know if that's a level 4 or level 1, but either way.
Yeah, hopefully more of a VATSIM specific answer than a real
Yes.
life one, but
Yes, exactly. Well, it seems like they've got a pretty good census to different levels and when they might use them.
yeah, those are some awesome responses, pretty well thought out. And Evan, do you have anything else to add before we move on?
No, that looks good to me.
All right. So here is a very, very, and I cannot stress enough, this is extremely simplified flow diagram that I, professionally made, addressing some of the different components involved in the autopilot system. Um, so again, this is a little bit off of the CRJ. It's a little bit dumbed down, but essentially you have that flight control panel or FCP. It's called different things on different airplanes, but that's where you're inputting commands to the autopilot or the flight director system. That sends data to two flight control computers, which calculate what needs to happen to achieve whatever it is that you just told the airplane to do. That data goes a couple places. It goes to servos, which are electrically or hydraulically operated depending on the airplane, and they will try and input a command response. They'll adjust ailerons, elevator, rudder if equipped, whatever it's doing, and try and make the airplane match what the flight control computer has calculated. The other place it goes to is the flight mode annunciator. And you can see I have a couple screenshots here on the right side of the screen that show that flight mode annunciator. And that's a really critical part of the automation on the airplane. So let's go back a little bit. Let's say ATC gives us a heading, and you click the heading button on the flight control panel. There's two little lights on the CRJ or the Challenger specifically. Again, this differs a little bit per airplane, but there's two little lights on the flight control panel of the CRJ or the Challenger. Those lights will light up. Those lights can lie to you, or not lie, but they may not give you the information that you think they're giving you. So on the CRJ, what those lights are indicating is that the flight control computer has received the input that you gave it, and it's determined it's appropriate. But it doesn't actually mean that the mode is active or armed. The only way to tell which modes are active at the time or armed at any specific time is to look at that flight mode annunciator. And that annunciator is there on pretty much any Part 25 airplane. It may be called a different thing, but it's on Boeing products, Airbus products, Bombardier, Embraer. It's a pretty industry standard component of a primary flight display. And what it does is it'll display active modes. In this case, on the left side of the screen, see in green there, it says FMS1 and climb 200. So that's telling you that the flight director is following the FMS generated track and it's in climb or flight level change at 200 knots. What you see on the right side is ALTS in white, which is altitude or selected altitude. In white indicates to you that it's armed, right? So what the airplane's going to do is climb at 200 knots and adjust pitch as necessary to maintain 200 knots. And then it's going to transition to capture the altitude that you pre-selected, which is 5,000 feet in this case on the right. And then ALTS or ALT will become the active mode. So where this can get you into trouble is if, let's say you're on an approach, you're getting vectored, you receive an approach clearance, and you click the approach button on the FCP. The two lights are going to light up because the flight control computers has agreed, okay, that makes sense. Approach mode is reasonable at this time. But approach mode may not actually be active. In fact, it may not even be armed. What you'd have to do is go back over to the flight mode annunciator and see what's there. Now, in theory, you'll see localizer and glide slope armed in white. but the airplane may have failed. It may not have actually armed either mode, and they certainly may not be active, especially if you're still receiving vectors. You're still a little ways away from the final approach course. So all of this is to say there's a ton of components. If any one of these components fails, the airplane won't do what you think it's doing or what you've told it to do. And identifying the problem can be hard too. Is it a servo? Is it a flight control computer? Is it a specific mode on the autopilot panel? There's a lot of different things that can go wrong. For flight sim purposes, things generally don't fail unless you program it to fail. But that flight mode enunciator is critical in understanding what the airplane's doing. And throughout the rest of the presentation, there's going to be a bunch of examples of specific scenarios from flight sim, and you'll see that flight mode enunciator in most of these screenshots. And we're going to use that as a discussion of what the autopilot's doing. Um, Most airlines, I don't remember what you said, Evan, for how you folks do it, but at my company, all changes to that flight mode enunciator below 3,000 feet are required to be called out by one or both of the pilots. It's very, very critical that low to the ground, that any changes to how the autopilot is functioning is known by both pilots, and that's why we have to make that call out. How do you guys do it, Evan?
Yeah, we actually even go further than that. So for us, it's literally any time that that flight mode enunciator changes, we're calling it
Oh,
out. So if we get a heading assignment even at 35,000 feet, or if I do go to a different vertical mode at 35,000 feet, I'm going to say vertical speed, and then I'm looking not just the fact that I pressed the button, but I'm looking back at, I'll use my shirt, looking at the FMA right here to actually say, yes, this is actually doing what I said it was doing, and I'm making sure that the other pilot is fully aware of that. So, of course, we're not flying in two crew environments very frequently in flight simulation, but that's a good practice to just build into your scan, right? So if you've been given a heading assignment, you press the heading button, or maybe you even, turn if you're going to set your flight director up, you want to make sure that up here somewhere it actually says heading. It doesn't just say LNAV still, because you may have put in that heading, but you may have forgotten to click the button. Or you might have clicked the button, but like Krikor said, something isn't working properly, and even though you think you should be on a heading, actually maybe the airplane is still following the guidance that it was following earlier.
yeah. There's even little stuff in the railroad. I mean, sometimes I press the button and maybe there's turbulence or I was just not
Yeah,
thinking. You don't press
yeah,
it hard enough and it doesn't engage. The only way you can tell is by looking at the FMA.
exactly.
So cool. So let's look at a couple examples. We're going to start with the J Fund 2 arrival into Boston, which, for those of you familiar with arrivals in the United States, in recent years, the FAA has transitioned to these complex RNAV arrivals that have specific transitions for each runway. So, depending on what runway the airport's landing, you may fly a completely different track than other runways. So, one of the first things we do in real life when we go to brief the approach or the arrival into an airport, if we have one of these arrivals, actually, if we have any arrival, we have to confirm that each fix on the arrival is in the FMS along with each altitude and speed constraint. It may be a pretty quick briefing. It may take a couple minutes depending on how many fixes there are, but that's a really important part to setting up the FMS and ensuring that it's actually going to follow the arrival. If it's missing waypoints, if it's missing speeds and altitudes, the airplane's not going to hit those for us. So I have here at the bottom of the screen, I don't know how well everyone can see it. Hopefully you can read it well enough. But I have a small portion highlighted, the runway 4 right transition on the J Fund arrival. So the way we'd brief this, or at least the way I tend to brief it, is Harris, spiced 7,220 knots, Griffey, Gabe, 6,220 knots, Joby, 6,210 knots, and then the vector. So really, it's just going by each individual fix. In real life, one pilot would look at the FMS, one pilot would look at the chart, and we'd kind of cross-reference with each other. On VATSIM, this task is a little bit harder because you have to do both of those roles. You have to read the chart, and you also have to look at the FMS. So maybe it's something you do a little bit sooner, do it at cruise when there's a lower workload. But really, this is the first step to ensuring that you've actually set up an arrival properly. In the bottom left, you can see the FMS for the Challenger. With this arrival loaded starting at Harris. So you can see the fixes, the altitude and speed constraints that I was talking about that you'd brief off of. On the upper right corner, you see the primary flight director or primary flight display, excuse me. Wow. For the Challenger as we're descending via the arrival. So you can see we're crossing Griffey. We're at 6,800 feet, descending to 6,000. V path is enunciated in green in the flight mode enunciator. That's the indication that the airplane is following the VNAV profile that the airplane's generated. You can also see on the right side, it looks, well, there's actually is a glide slope there in blue, but there's also that magenta I'm not actually sure what the word is for that. The symbol that's used generally to identify fixes, but that's the VNAV vertical deviation indicator. So it shows us that we're on the calculated path. We're doing 220 knots, which is what the arrival specifies. And if you see very closely, it's kind of hard to see, but just inside that 5 mile arc on the nav display or the horizontal situation indicator, you can see there's a little white arc that's just intercepting Gabe. And that's, we call it the banana bar. It has a more official name in the FMS, the range to altitude bar, but it's telling you at what point you're expected to level off at the selected altitude if nothing changes. So we can see that that's over Gabe, and that's a good indication that we're going to finish that descent at Gabe. Depending on your airplane, the process for following this arrival may be a little bit different. Boeing airplanes, it's usually LNAV, VNAV as long as everything is calculated properly, and then you just scroll the altitude selector to the bottom altitude on the arrival. The Challenger, the CRJ, it's a little bit more involved if you want the airplane to follow the published speeds. Airbuses, I'm not as familiar with. I want to say it's managed mode, but I'm probably incorrect about that, and
That sounds
I'm not
Airbusy.
sure what's that.
I believe that. That sounds Airbusy.
It's something like that anyway. And then what do you look for on the Embraers?
Yeah, we have an FMS speed mode on the Embraer, although we actually quite frequently just use manual speed in these environments anyway for reasons.
Okay, interesting. But the point is, it depends a little bit on the airplane, and that's something that you have to look into to make sure that your airplane's following the arrival properly. But the entire way down in real life, we're monitoring the airplane to make sure we're complying with some of the restrictions. If we cross spiced at 10,000, obviously something is incorrect because we should be 3,000 feet lower. And that's where you'd probably want to start dumbing down the automation, begin a descent to 7,000 to get back on the arrival, and then figure out the problem later.
Yeah, or even ask for vectors, let air traffic control know what's going on. And, we get it, like in flight simulation. I mean, this is hard enough in real life, but in flight simulation, we have different developers who are building different airplanes. Some airplanes can do things really well. Sometimes you've set up everything perfectly, and the FMS might show all the proper restrictions. But as Kiki said, you've got that banana bar there that's showing that you're supposed to, in this example, cross Gabe at the recommended 6,000 or the required 6,000. You might be at 10,000 feet, and this is not looking proper, even though you've put everything in properly. So, as a flight sim pilot, I would say it's even more critical to be watching
Yeah.
and not trusting because you just never know how these developers, in some cases, have built airplanes. We've seen everything from phenomenal quality developers to people who are literally just putting shells on the outside of airplanes, right? So, depending what you're flying, it's all the more important to make sure that okay, great, everything's in the box. That's definitely step one. Step two is to try your best to fly it and make sure that you're seeing all the right modes in the FMA. But then step three is like just be looking and going, okay, well this says Gabe at 6,000, and even though it looks like I'm going to make it, I'm at 15,000, and there's only 5 miles to go. Something isn't right here, like you said.
Yeah, and like you said, Evan, if something's not working, just tell ATC. It's 100 times better if you're up
Yeah.
front and you say, "Hey, something's not working here. Can we get a hard altitude? Can we get a speed?" If you ask for it, we can plan around it, and controllers are able to expect that and work with you. If you don't say anything and you're just not following it, it increases the controller's workload a lot, especially during major events or times when there's a lot of traffic. All right, good with it, Evan. Or anything else you want to add?
Oh, I think that's great. Let's keep going.
All right, clean it up, make it big. This is a big CRJ term. I don't know if it's used on other airplanes as far as this phrase, but the concept certainly is. So we're on the downwind back in that previous example on the arrival on the J Fund arrival into Boston going to 4 right. And if you guys have charts, feel free to pull them up and follow along. The next, I think, couple slides we'll be talking about some Boston procedures. But the Boston controller says SkyWest 3962, turn right heading 310 to center maintain 3000. All right, so obviously it's giving you a heading and an altitude. That much is pretty straightforward. But what else are they implying? What else can you gather from this instruction based on where you are on the arrival?
That might be a good question for the chat. So again, wherever you are watching, post it in the chat. Tell us what you think. You've just been told turn right heading 310, descend and maintain 3000. Haven't been told anything else necessarily, but what does that mean for us? What is that telling us that we might be expecting to do? So I'll give people a second to share some thoughts wherever you may be watching. By the way, we were right about managed speed apparently. Pilot THK on the FSA YouTube says we're correct about that. and also chipped in earlier and said that the Part 135 operator that they fly for, same thing, verbally communicate input with the autopilot at any altitude. So that one
Yeah.
is good to know that we're on the way there. So yeah, what do people think? I'm looking at a couple of answers and on what people think. The better CP on the VATSIM Twitch says you're on the way home, which is a nice cryptic way of answering my question, I think. Give people
Nice.
another couple seconds to share any thoughts you have. What do you think this might mean? You've got a heading, you've got an altitude. Post it in the chat wherever you're watching. Tell us what you think. I should say Matt Bartles as well, who's helping us run this on the VATSIM side, is very proud of that meme because that's his. That's actually I'm looking at that in Discord right now. That's his like Discord meme as well.
Nice.
Louis Chris 9 says you can expect to intercept the localizer. Yep, that's a pretty good one right there. I think that might be all we're gonna get. So Kiki, tell us, what does it
Yeah,
mean?
so you're pretty much right on it. It's an implication that you're about to start the approach. So your mindset should shift from the arrival from that terminal environment to, okay, we're going to fly this approach. Um, so we'll start with going back to that FMA, and I don't think I have a screenshot here. I think I have some on the next slide. In fact, let me double check that. Yeah. So what? I guess I kind of just gave it away if you guys were watching keenly. But what should you be seeing in the FMA? This is another good one to add to the chat, right? So you just got a heading and an altitude assignment. What kind of modes should you see enunciated in that flight mode enunciator, either lateral or vertical?
And again, any airplane that you're flying, we won't get too caught up in
Yeah.
the exact lingo there, but are you expecting to see navigation mode stuff? So that's magenta or white in a lot of airplanes. Are you expecting to see LNAV, VNAV, maybe heading mode, maybe an altitude mode? What do you think once you're given this heading and an altitude would be a good sort of check to see on the FMA? So give people a second to come up with that answer. I've got a couple more people chiming in. Bad Luck 95 saying vectors to final, so it's a good time for the approach and landing checklist. Good point. TR on the FSA captain chat says off the arrival at vectors to final, so answering that question from before. So people are definitely catching on to that, which is good. And so the better CP on the VATSIM Twitch says maybe you could expect to see LPA or FPV potentially in terms of getting your descent going. So that makes sense to me as a potential mode for the navigation. Any other comments is what you might see in that FMA here, and we are a little bit delayed because we're looking at so many different places, so I may not do a great job. But Bad Luck 95 says you could expect maybe arm the approach mode. You might have loc mode on standby, which is a great answer as well. And I think the biggest thing you're probably seeing now is you've been given a heading, so you can expect to be in heading mode. So we're not following a navigation course anymore. We're in a heading mode. As someone just said, we've probably got the localizer or the final approach course tuned up, ready to go, armed to capture. Great examples, everybody. Thank you for the participation.
Yeah, those are some great answers, and you guys got most of the stuff we're about to go through. So the big thing is you should be seeing a heading mode of some sort. Most planes, it's just heading. You should see 3,000 feet dialed into the altitude selector, and then some vertical mode. You could have a level change mode, a speed mode, a vertical speed mode, but something that's going to work on descending you down to 3,000 feet. So we'll go through that and a couple other things. Here I have a number of pictures. So on the upper left, I have 2,000 feet. So I wasn't following my own slideshow when I created this. Um, but you can see I have heading mode, vertical speed. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong thing. So that's a vertical speed of 2,000 feet per minute. It's been a minute since I wrote this. I apologize. And you can see ALTS is armed in white there, indicating the altitude selection. Another thing you can do, and how you do this depends a little bit on the airplane. I know Boeing FMSs tend to be kind of similar to the picture I have here. Airbuses are a little bit different, and the Embers, I really have no idea. But you can essentially clean up the FMS so that the only thing there is the approach. So what I did here was I brought Winnie or Winey, which is the furthest out fix for runway 4 right in Boston, up into L2 as if I was going to go direct to that fix. But in the bottom right, and this is the difference here, there's an intercept course of 035. So what that's essentially doing is the FMS is going to draw an artificial radial off of Winey so that you could intercept really far out in navigation mode. This is really useful in real life. We use this all the time, especially at major airports like Charlotte, where I fly to a lot. The approach controllers tend to have us join on like a 20 or 30-mile final. That far out, you're actually not receiving the localizer signal most of the time. And even if you are receiving it, that may not be an approved navigation source if it's outside the certified service volume of that ILS. Most localizers only go to 18 nautical miles. Um, so you can use the FMS to actually join the final approach course. You'll see this during an event. If Boston is getting overwhelmed with traffic and we have a 30-mile final, and the approach controller tells you join the localizer.
Like when you're working final, you mean?
Like when I'm working final. Exactly. When I'm working final and I'm falling apart, and I tell you to join the localizer on a 30-mile final, um, you probably won't be receiving it, and this may be the only way to do it. So this can be really useful. Otherwise, you'll just stay on that downwind heading that I gave you, and you'll end up in Portugal.
So if you go back, Kiki, just 2 slides to the example before, one more slide. So here we've got, like you can see in the bottom right, I'll just take him off the screen for a second. You can see there's all this stuff that's sitting in the bottom right? We've got all those waypoints along the J-fund arrival. And now if you go advance back to 2 slides, as soon as we got that heading and altitude, now we've taken all that stuff out. So all those arrival fixes, Gabe and Joby, those are gone. We don't need them anymore. And so we don't have to have that clutter sitting around on the screen. Now our navigation is just showing us here's our actual final approach course that we're going to join. And as he said, we could join that approach course via a localizer mode, so actually tracking the localizer directly through the radio signal, but we also could intercept this FMS generated course, and that is a great thing to do. So, you've probably been there at some point, because we've certainly vectored pilots in this scenario where they're saying, I can't pick up the localizer. LAX is a great place for this, because just like Charlotte, you get those long 30, 40-mile finals coming in from the east. This is a way that you can actually track the localizer when you can't physically receive the radio signal yet. And so it's a great trick for pilots to be able to use.
Yeah. Thank you, Evan. You'll see a couple more screenshots on the right here taking you through some different FMA sequencing as you get cleared for the approach. So on the right, you can see we're still in heading mode. We have ALTS cap indicating the airplane has leveled off and is capturing that 3,000 foot altitude that's been selected. And then you can see we have approach, loc 1, and glide slope armed in white. In the next screenshot down one, and I guess I could have separated these a bit, but you can see we've switched into LNAV is the active mode. So what's actually happening there is because of the sensitivity of the FMS, it actually first intercepts the FMS generated course, that one that we just cleaned up and made big. So it actually picks that up first. Localizer is still armed. And then as it receives the signal, it picks up the localizer and it switches into loc 1. Glide slope in this picture is still armed. You can see it hasn't come in quite yet on the right side of the screen there. Another important thing to check, someone in the chat said it, which is a awesome piece of input there, is make sure that you have the correct frequency tuned. Make sure that it's active. If it's not active, you may need to swap it manually, which we'll come back to why this is so critical here in just a minute, in a couple slides. But you can see in the bottom left, loc 1, IBOS, which is the correct localizer for this approach, the correct course, 035. And then this airplane also gives you time to go, which is 4 minutes in this case, and 12.3 nautical miles on the DME reading. So all of these things happen very, very quickly. But again, it mostly comes back into setting things up early on and paying attention to that FMA. If you see the localizer, come by, go centered, go off to the other side, and the airplane never intercepts it, something's wrong. And that's where you need to either use a heading mode or disconnect it and fly manually on the ILS or do something, even if it's just telling approach and saying, hey, we need to be revectored because we didn't pick up the localizer.
Perfect. We talk departures?
Yeah, let's do it. So here we have our favorite Sox 6 departure named after the second greatest baseball team in the MLB. But we're going to talk a little bit about RNF. What's that?
What's the first?
The Nationals.
Okay. We'll see what people think about that.
I'm sure I'm going to get outvoted, but hey, I tried. My roommate's a Yankees fan, so, we have spirited conversations about that. So this is, and Boston controllers, I'm sure will be happy to back me up, probably one of the most common issues we have at Boston, especially if we're in the 2-2 config, landing and departing runways 2-2 left and 2-2 right. We run into this issue all the time. So here on the left, we have the FAA plate for the departure, which has you making a pretty immediate left turn to this fixed TJ. Really what you're doing is intercepting a course, but the point is you're going left to TJ. So we're going to go through the sequence of setting this up and briefing the departure and looking at it. So the first thing we do, similar to that arrival scenario that we talked about earlier, is go through the FMS and check every fix and make sure it matches. So we start with the runway 22 right. We have an runway heading to an intercept point to go to TJ, to go to Bro and cross Bro at 250 knots, excuse me, above 3,000 feet, Bukick, and then onwards and onwards. But excuse me. The point is we're verifying that every fix in the FMS matches the chart. And we're doing that at the gate before we've even pushed to make sure everything is set up properly. On the right side, you can see a small portion of the navigation display in the Challenger. And again, you can see that visual left turn to intercept the course. And that roughly matches the departure. So kind of a sanity check that everything is there the way you would expect it to be. The next few slides are going to go through some flight mode enunciator things for this departure. So the first is getting on the runway. You can see we have that nice fancy synthetic vision in these fancy new Challengers. So we actually have a runway. You can see we're aligned with it. At the very bottom of the screen, you can see the runway heading 214. So we're lined up with the center line. And everything is set up. We have 200 knots dialed into the speed pre-select, and that depends on the company. That's what my company uses. Others use different speeds. 5,000 feet is set for the initial altitude. We have a proper altimeter setting that brings us right to sea level, which of course Boston is at. And we have in the flight mode enunciator takeoff, takeoff. So the takeoff, lateral, and vertical modes. And I think people on VATSIM don't often or at flight sim in general rather, don't often realize how many airplanes have takeoff flight director modes. So on the CRJ or the Challenger, you don't hit anything on that FCP. You actually hit the toga buttons on the side of the thrust levers, and that's what causes those modes to come up. The other thing it does is it slews the FMS position to the runway, which it's not as recognized, I guess is the word I'll use, but it does have some other functions as well. So the point is, when we get on the runway, we line up, we do a really quick sanity check to make sure everything is set up properly. All of this, other than the flight director mode, should have been done at the gate,
And
before you taxi.
And same thing for us. So part of our process as we're lining up on the runway is we'll literally verbalize, okay, I can see runway 22 right. I can see the numbers on the pavement, or I can see a sign that says 22 right. And then I'm going to look in the FMS and go, does it say runway 22 right? And then my next thing I'm going to do is verify that the heading I've got bugged, which I have here 214, is the runway heading. And after that, if I'm on an RNAV departure, I'm going to make sure that I actually have my next waypoint matches up with the chart. And those are just absolutely critical things that you should be doing every time that you're lining up on the runway. You'll hear in some airports, we don't use it at Boston, but you hear the phrase RNAV2 and then a particular waypoint that's used at places like Atlanta, other places where they have parallel departures. That's like a really good cue to go, okay, he just said RNAV to SLAW. I better make sure that SLAW is the first waypoint in my FMS. That's not phraseology that we use at Boston, so you have to remember to do that on your own. But just as a standard practice, you're lining up on the runway, make sure it's the proper runway, make sure we've got the proper heading that we're flying bugged, set up, and make sure that if we got here, the FMA is all set up as we need to. And then if we're on an RNAV departure, let's verify that that first waypoint that we see in the FMS is in fact the proper waypoint we should be going to.
Yeah, exactly, Evan. Thank you. The next slide here, we have the initial departure sequence. You can see we're climbing out of 1,000 feet. So now the flight modes, we have LNAV. So I've engaged the navigation mode and it's accepted it. It's made the mode active. The autopilot is engaged. You can see it's in yellow now. We have flight level change. So we're climbing at 175 knots selected. What you can see here is the airplane started to make a very gentle turn to the left, but that's obviously not gentle enough to get to TJ. So it's starting to bring you in that direction. What you can see in the bottom right, though, remember I mentioned that you're actually joining a course or a radial? Yeah, it's not really a radial, but you're joining a course inbound to TJ. You can actually see at the bottom of the primary flight display that lateral offset indicator or course deviation indicator, and that's starting to come in. So as that magenta, diamond, star, whatever you want to call it, starts to come closer and closer to center, the airplane is going to begin continuing that left turn to intercept the course to TJ. You can also see that in that bar at the top of the display, at the top of the navigation display there, TJ is now in magenta. What that's telling you is the airplane has sequenced to TJ. That is now the active fix that the airplane is navigating towards. So there's a lot of clues that you can pick up that the airplane is correctly making that intercept to TJ. In the real world, departing Washington's Reagan Airport off of runway 1, there's a whole bunch of prohibited airspace about a half mile immediately north of the airport. So we have a special procedure there where we start turning at 150 feet, engage the FMS, and wait for it to pick up. If we hit at 400 feet, the FMS should pick up properly. That's when it allows for FMS to become active. If it doesn't, then we immediately declare with the Potomac approach that we don't have RNAV, it's not working, and we request a heading because we don't want to risk violating that airspace. But we also want to tell ATC as soon as we know that it's not working. I'll go through one more slide here. You can see now we've actually correctly picked up the course to TJ. We've started to accelerate, and ALT's cap is active. So it's accepting that 5,000 foot altitude, and it's beginning to lower the nose to maintain that altitude. This is a good time to start to clean up the airplane, accelerate, do your after takeoff checklist, and then ensure that you don't go through that 5,000 foot initial altitude. There may be traffic above you. What's really important here is if the airplane does not make that turn to TJ. If you take off, you get to 1,000 feet, you put the gear up, you start to accelerate, and the airplane's still going straight ahead, something's wrong and it hasn't picked up that course. And you need to recognize that quickly and tell the tower or the approach controller so they can work with you. If you keep going straight out while everyone else is turning left, suddenly you're not in the flow of traffic. And that causes a huge problem, especially during events, on top of the fact that all the virtual rich folks living down there are going to get pretty upset at all the noise. So it's really critical that you recognize on departures with that immediate turn, or really any departure that's RNAV based, if the airplane's not following the procedure, and you tell air traffic control so they can help you out and they can give you vectors or alternate instructions. Anything to add for this one, Evan?
No, I think you've got it. So you're going to give us an example now of what happened to you at Syracuse, right?
Yeah.
Let's see it.
All right, so we'll transition into this one. So this was a flight I had back when I was very, very new to the airplane. I was just off of my initial training on it. And we were going up to Syracuse, New York. It was a night flight. It was VMC out. The weather wasn't that bad. The clouds were at about 3,000 feet, but really nothing crazy. And I was the pilot flying. So I'm going to preface this with it was a relatively small mistake, one that I'm sure that a lot of people on VATSIM have made, but it was a really good learning experience. And it was something that stuck with me for quite a while. So you can see, just to go through the images on the screen, the upper left, we have a view of the track from FlightAware. So that was what actually happened with the flight. The bottom left, we have the radio tuning unit, or RTU, on the CRJ, and it's set up correctly the way it was on this flight. And then on the upper right, we have a portion of the approach chart. And the really important stuff to note here is the ILS is 109.9, and the Syracuse VOR is 117.0. And the Syracuse VOR is located about 5 miles north and west of the field. It's not on the airport. And this is really important. Another critical thing is understanding the differences in your airplanes. Just because you're a CRJ 700 doesn't mean you have the same equipment as another CRJ 700. Among our airplanes alone, we have variations in VNAV, FMSs, radio tuning units, if the airplane can intercept an ILS in white needles, or if you need to manually switch to green needles, and if it automatically tunes the radio frequency for the approach. And that's what caused an issue this time. What we normally do when we brief the approach is we put the frequency for the ILS in the standby, and that's what you can see there, 1099 in white. On most of our newer airplanes, when we get close to the approach, it will automatically tune the frequency and make it active. So we don't actually have to do anything. The airplane will do it for us. The other thing it does is it creates these blue approach needles on the primary flight display that we call ghost needles that indicate to us the approach course is there. And then when it comes centered, we can hit approach mode and the autopilot will do its thing. I did most of my initial training on some of our newer airplanes. I didn't really have a lot of experience with our older airplanes that won't do this for you. Wouldn't you know it, that's what I was flying on this flight, one of those older airplanes. And I hadn't adjusted to this difference yet. So approach left us pretty high and pretty fast. We had speed brakes out. We're at idle thrust, trying to descend and lose energy and lose airspeed. But the autopilot was on. It looked like everything was going to work out. But I'm a little bit behind the airplane at this point, and I hadn't really recognized it yet. We get cleared for the approach. I put an intercept heading, and I arm approach mode. And I'm sitting there thinking, fat, dumb, and happy, thinking, okay, the airplane's going to take care of this for me. I can sit back and pretend like I know what I'm doing. And all of a sudden, the captain goes, "What's your plan to intercept the localizer?" And I was like, "Oh, we're in approach mode. It'll do it." He goes, "What do you mean? We just went through it." So my side of the airplane was not indicating that we'd gone through the approach yet, but his side was. So what ended up happening, I'll show you this on the right. The airplane had tuned the Syracuse VOR as the active frequency. And it does this so that the FMS can calculate our position using VORs as kind of a backup system of determining where we are. And it had auto tuned the course based on that VOR. So what happened was it was actually drawing a localizer about 5 miles north of where the actual localizer was. So you can see this diagram overlaid on the Syracuse approach plate. The green is where I thought the airplane was because my side was indicating that we hadn't hit the localizer yet. The red on top is where we actually were. We'd already gone through the localizer. We just hadn't intercepted this fake localizer that the airplane was drawing for us. So what it led to was the captain and I had different understandings of where the airplane were. I'd lost my situational awareness, and the automation was telling me information that didn't make sense and that I wasn't able to work with. So let's hear from you guys. What would you do in this scenario? And there's a lot of different answers there's a lot of right answers too. And Evan, please feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah, I think this is a great example. This type of thing has happened a lot in real life, affecting two professional airline pilots. I can think of the Air Canada incident at San Francisco, where they just about landed on a taxiway, partially caused by this same thing of a situation where they were expecting an auto tune that didn't happen. There was an accident up in northern Canada with a Boeing 737 that I can recall, similar type story, where you have captain thinking one thing, first officer thinking another thing, because we've got two different navigation sources. So this is a really interesting subject to bring up. So I'll leave it to you on the chat. Lots of people who are in all kinds of different places. Tell us what you think. What would you do if you were in that position where you thought you were in the sort of initially the gray airplane? You find out, uh-oh, I'm actually in the red airplane. I'm north of the localizer. Maybe I'm a little bit high. How could I possibly resurrect this situation? So far, VATSIM came up and suggested that you file a VATSAP, which I thought was pretty clever.
Thanks.
So for those who don't, you want to explain what an ATSAP, what an actual ATSAP report is for anyone who doesn't know?
I'm sorry, were you asking if I
Yeah,
could
yeah,
explain it or?
yeah.
Yeah, so essentially an ASAP or an ATSAP. Yeah. Actually, I'm going to let you take this one, Evan.
Okay, so like, well, there's basically, I think the joke is that there's like a in the real world sort of like an SMS report. There's a way you can go and sort of file something that says, hey, we screwed up. This is what happened, and it's used for trending and for learning. So they're just making a pun on that, basically.
Okay, yeah.
That's what
Sorry,
they're trying
I
to do.
wasn't sure if I was. That's what I thought, but yeah. Anyway,
All right,
thank you.
so I've got a bunch of answers. I'm going to fire them at you. You can kind of collect them and tell me what you think about them. FSA Captain Matt says ask for another vector, so basically go around, start again. Eric agrees, time to go around. Gary says, what about we just disable the FMS, turn off the autopilot, turn off the flight director, hand fly it in. We can see the airport, so let's give that a shot. On the VATSIM Twitch, a number of suggestions. The better CP says just disconnect from the network. Vectors to reintercept the localizer, so ask ATC for help. Teleapproach, you can take the visual, is another suggestion. On the VAT USA Twitch, another one, ask ATC to vector me around. Looking at the Pilot Club, some great conversation on the Pilot Club's YouTube channel today, by the way. So, but a lot of people saying go around, advise ATC, ask for vectors. Good suggestions coming in there. The Sim Captain on the VAT USA YouTube channel has an interesting one. What about giving control to the captain? He's got the correct information dialed in. He seems to be the most situationally aware. So what if you say, hey, you've got it, you have control. Give him the opportunity to basically do that. Another one, Eric says, if it wasn't too far past the localizer, I'd scroll in the heading, use the autopilot, turn to the left, and basically kind of set things back up, but use the automation to help relieve the fact that if I'm trying to hand fly this, maybe there's a bit of extra workload. So he's suggesting let's keep the automation on. So kind of got the full spectrum of options there. I'm liking all those
Yeah,
really.
those were some awesome responses, and honestly, this is a huge part of why I love the community is because like some of that stuff I wouldn't have even thought of. So I'll add a little bit of context that I realize I left out. So we were cleared for a visual approach, and we did have the runway in sight. The entire event happened within about 60 seconds. It was over very, very quickly, and I'm somewhat exaggerating for the purposes of this conversation. But what ended up happening was I had the runway in sight. I said, okay, clearly I've messed up something with the programming here. I'm going to fly the airplane and have you get everything set back up. So I disconnected the autopilot, started bringing the airplane back left, flipped into green needles, had the captain switch the frequency for me, and then we were able to join the ILS and fly it the rest of the way down. I know Evan and I had a lengthy conversation when we started talking about this, about hand flying, and how both of us are huge proponents of hand flying. So at smaller airports like Syracuse, I like to hand fly the approach anyway, as long as there's no reason not to. Um, so yeah, and you can actually see if I go back a slide, you can see we went about a mile through it, came back in, joined the approach, and it wasn't that big a deal. Um, the big takeaway from this is one, it can happen to anybody. Like you said, Evan, this happened to two real life airline crews. I mean, we've both been trained. I like to think I'm proficient, or I like to think I do generally a decent job. But obviously here I lost my situational awareness and didn't do as good as I should have. I think it's also a good lesson in humility and understanding that, just because the Air Canada accident that was pretty highly criticized, or another a large number of real life accidents, they're very easy to Monday morning quarterback. But I think people don't realize how easy it is to fall into some of those traps, especially when you do this day in and day out. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of my real life example. I don't know if you have anything that you have to add, or that you'd like to follow up on, Evan.
No, I think I'll talk. Did you want to just tell us what you did?
Yeah, so I ended up disconnecting the autopilot. Again, I had the runway in sight at this point, so I initiated a left turn back towards the runway. Began to slow down and configure the airplane. Put it into manually switched into green needles, so we were tracking the localizer, and had the captain reach over, since I was hand flying, and flip the frequency to be active, so I was seeing the proper localizer and glide path. And from there, we were able to rejoin. I mean, I chose to hand fly it. I could have re-engaged the autopilot at that stage. If we had been closer to the airport, inside the final approach fix or something, it probably would have been a go around. The answer about giving controls to the captain is a really good idea, and I hadn't thought about that. So thank you for contributing that, because that's a really good idea.
Yeah, a couple, just Louis Chris on VATSIM Twitch, great point. Just says every time you fly, it's a learning experience, and I couldn't agree more. Like I've
Yeah,
been flying since what 2008, and maybe even earlier than that, and he's absolutely right. And like every time I just think a little bit, like, okay, I've got this. Something happens on that flight that's like, nope, down you go, back to square one. I'm like, because that's absolutely what it is. We are always, each of us, learning every time we fly, and that applies on the network. That applies in real life, of course, just as well. Good question from an FSA first officer saying if the runway wasn't in sight, so if you're in IMC in this scenario, obviously, approach is probably going to be a little bit more helpful because they're seeing the fact that you're off the localizer. But take this, scenario into your IMC or you don't have the runway in sight. What would you do then?
that's a good question. I think my first thought would be to say something to air traffic control. My big concern is terrain clearance. If we went through the localizer, we were issued the approach clearance based on the fact that the altitude we had would keep us clear of obstacles to the localizer, and then we could follow the approach down. If we're up on the north side, now we don't know what's there terrain wise. I don't remember if there's anything on the chart north of Syracuse, um, but yeah, my first thought would probably be to talk to ATC, get a heading and an altitude, and then sort out what was wrong after.
Yeah, and I think if I'm, anywhere close to being low to the ground, whatever definition we may have for that, depending on the phase of flight and where we are, I'm just going to treat it like a go around. So literally, it's,
Yeah,
go around just as if I was going around from 100 feet. Like I want altitude, I want speed, and I want to get out of this, potentially questionable situation if I'm worried about the ground. If I'm at 4,000 feet and I know the ground's at 500, okay, I'm not so worried about that. So we've got a bit more time to talk through things. I've got lots to talk about on hand flying and some other stuff that we can certainly come back to, but you've got a good slide
yeah.
that kind of wraps things up. So why don't you talk to that, and then we can just sort of come back to that comments about hand flying that we started on a minute ago.
Okay, yeah. So here's just a couple points. The first is, like I said, automation is really complicated. I mean, this is just scratching the surface. Excuse me. Wow. On most of the stuff we talked about, you could talk about this for hours. Airline training goes on to this for hours. It's a huge part of the curriculum, and like you just said, Evan, this is a learning experience. Every day on the job, I learn new things. I've recently learned about some quirky behavior on joining the ILS or joining a localizer on the CRJ because of how the airplane calculates wind correction angle. And just, I guess it was yesterday morning going into Charlotte, had to disconnect and hand fly and intercept on the localizer to avoid a TCAS RA. So you learn every day in real life on VATSIM, no matter what you're doing. You can always keep learning more. And in that vein, it takes years to learn how to manage it well. I mean, I'm still learning. Evan's still learning. We're all still learning. We've been doing this for not a long time, but quite a while. Even professionals that I fly with that have been flying jets for 30 years are still learning new things. Um, so you need to keep your mind open to learning. You can always learn more. It's such an incredible part of this industry. This is almost more important for VATSIM than it is in the real life. I mean, obviously the stakes are lower, right? You don't have real humans sitting behind you, but in real life, you have a second person there to check your work, right? My little thing in Syracuse, a big part of why that wasn't a big deal was I had another guy that said, "Hey, what are you doing? This doesn't look right." We were able to talk it out and work together to resolve it. You don't have that safety net on VATSIM. You're by yourself, and you're also flying airplanes that may not behave the same all the time, or may have flaws, or may have bugs. I mean, you may not be able to turn right in some situations and have to learn to find a way around that. So it's really, really critical that you try and understand the airplane that you're flying and try and understand the automation so you limit causing problems. Or that's not a good way of phrasing it, but
I think
I
we
think
got
you
it.
get the yeah, sorry. We're all still learning. Keep educating yourself, keep improving. Attending a seminar like this is the first step. Starting that conversation, asking questions, and doing everything you can to improve and learn more. And lastly, thank you all for being here. Thank you for listening. And I know we both appreciate it.
Perfect. And to sum up from my perspective, just we were talking a bit about hand flying, and like you said, I mean, we're both big fans of that, especially in jetliners. What's kind of interesting is that in our procedures, and you probably have a similar statement, designed for real airline pilots, there is a phrase that basically says the autopilot is not for rescuing you when you've flown the airplane badly. Do not engage the autopilot to try to fix, your poor flying. And that's a really interesting point. I'm like, wow, that's right in airline material, and it's there because that's a really important point. We need to be able to safely hand fly, operate the airplane basically anytime because as Krikor has shown, we don't know when something with the automation may screw up. And in his case, it wasn't necessarily the automation not working properly. It was just that garbage in, garbage out example that we came back to from the beginning. Other times you may not have that and you may be going, well, what the heck is this thing doing? So I know maybe that the stereotypical, somebody said autopilot 97% of the time earlier. I would say that the stereotypical sort of maybe flight simulator pilot might be using the automation perhaps a little bit too much. So make sure there is absolutely a time and a place for hand flying. There is a time and a place for automation. There's certainly some crossover in that Venn diagram, but make sure you're comfortable flying the airplane that you choose to fly on the network. If you're flying offline in single player, that's a great time to try out something new. When you're flying into a busy FNO event in the US or when you're flying into a busy event in Europe, you're flying across the pond, that's a time to know your airplane, to know that if I had to, I could hand fly this procedure just as well. And correspondingly, if I had to, I could use the automation right down to minimums or right at 400 feet off the ground because that's what I'm planning to do because it's going to be so busy. I'm dealing with gear and flaps and talking to departure. That's a great time for the autopilot to be on. So I would encourage anyone who's flying to give yourself the opportunity to hand fly. Don't be afraid to do it, but make sure you're comfortable with that automation when you're flying with air traffic control in busy ATC airspace. So with that in mind, I think we've got lots of time for questions, and I'm looking forward to those. You can again post those questions anywhere you are watching. I will be scrolling through all the chats to try and capture the questions. If you're an FSA captain, send those through our live chat. If you're a first officer, send those through the website. I've already got 3 of them lined up, so Krieger, I'm just going to start firing these off at you as we go. Some
Okay.
great questions that are all kind of interesting discussion points too, and I'm sure there'll be more that come up as we go. So starting off with an FSA first officer question. This is a great one because actually you and I probably have different procedures. So the question is, on departure, the aircraft has got to level off a little bit so that it can make that acceleration up to 250 knots. Is that okay? Is there a minimum, climb rate that I have to maintain? Should I level off to accelerate to 250? Should I stay slower so I can climb faster? What do you recommend for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think about the best way to approach this. The short answer is there's going to be a lot of variation. I'm sure there's some differences company to company. Um, Generally speaking, ATC understands there's going to be these different segments of the climb where you're going to be climbing at different speeds and essentially level off to accelerate. Up high, generally, ATC expects 500 feet per minute. If you're unable to maintain 500 feet per minute, that may be okay. You just need to say something to them. But that's if you can't make that climb. If you are needing to momentarily level off to accelerate, that's okay. Personally, I've learned pitch settings that work very well. So I tend to, when I'm accelerating to 250 knots, for example, bring the nose to about 7 or 7.5 degrees, depending on weight. And that'll give me usually between 1,000 and 1,500 feet per minute while also accelerating to 250 knots. So usually what I prefer to do is just reduce the climb rate and also climb while accelerating. If your airplane has a VNAV climb function, like the CRJ, it does, but we're not approved to use it. But if you're flying an Airbus or a Boeing or something like that, and you have a VNAV mode or a managed mode, I guess, it may provide guidance for that. And so you could probably just fly the flight director, and that will give you the best guidance on how to accelerate.
Excellent.
Evan, feel free to chime in,
No,
please.
I
You have
mean
more
that you could spend
experience
a
with
whole
this.
other webinar asking that question. So I guess the moral of the story is I'd also look at. You may have said this, and I apologize because I was busy scrolling through chats. But if there's any specific altitude restriction on the chart, did you talk about that already?
No, I didn't. That's a good one. Thank
So
you.
if there's a waypoint that says you must cross this waypoint at 4,000 feet, or Chicago's a good example where there's actually a DME arc that you have to cross a waypoint by a certain altitude, that's where I would go and make sure that I make that altitude first. So if there's nothing else on the departure that tells me I have to cross a waypoint at a certain speed, I'm going to actually pull the speed back. I might even stay slower. I might even have some flaps out because I have to make that initial climb restriction, and then once I've passed it, I can accelerate. So I'd look at the instrument departure procedure that you're flying. If it doesn't have any guidance on it, then basically there's just a minimum climb grade you have to maintain, which we're not going to get into for flight sim purposes. If you generally kind of get the airplane cleaned up, so raise your gear, raise your flaps. Once you're at flap zero and you can safely get up to 250 knots, that's kind of the way that you do it in most standard cases. Here's an interesting one. So you're being told to vectors to final. You start to see the localizer coming in. Approach is super busy, and they haven't actually said join the localizer yet. What do you do? Do you go through or do you make the turn to join on your own? That's a tough question as well.
That's a good question. It's actually something we were just talking about earlier. I apologize if you hear my cat, by the way. I'm not sure if that's coming through, but he's having his nightly meltdown. Anyway, um, the short of it is ask. If they haven't told you to join the localizer, they may be intentionally flying you through it to build some separation. So you don't want to just join uncommanded, but at the same time, they may have just forgotten. So the best is to try and get a word in and ask them if they'd like you to join or if they want you to keep on the heading. It is required if ATC is going to intentionally vector you through the localizer. They're supposed to tell you that. But if they're busy or they may have just forgotten, they may have just let that slip.
Yeah, and I mean, I've flown with pilots who would say in that scenario, if it's too busy to ask, they would probably just join the localizer, and I've flown with others who'd probably just stay on the heading. So that's a really tough one to to be able to answer without knowing a bit more context. But for sure,
Yeah.
in best practice is ask, right? And hey, if you go through the localizer, all that's going to happen is you just get vectored back around. That's probably a better outcome than you make a turn that you're not supposed to. Now let's take that same scenario, add on the layer of ATC has said, fly heading 310, expect a vector across the localizer. Now what do we do when we start to see that localizer come in?
Right. And that's they're explicitly telling you that they're going to vector you through it, so you don't want to join the localizer. They're probably trying to build a couple extra miles of space or something like that.
Yep, and that actually happened today. I mean, I this just a few hours ago. Funny, the question comes up from the Better CP on Twitch, but this happened today. I was vectoring an airplane at Boston, and I said, "Hey, expect to go through the localizer because I'm going to put somebody in front of you." And instead of doing that, they just turned right onto the localizer right in front of the traffic, and then we ended up having two airplanes that had to get resequenced instead of zero. So listen carefully for that instruction, and as always, if we're not sure about the situation, that's a great time to ask. So, speaking of questions, Ricardo says they were given an instruction they didn't understand. It was descend and maintain 10,000, transition to 250 knots. They didn't know what to do with their airspeed. So, first of all, if you don't understand what would be a good thing to do, that's an easy one. And then, can you tell us what that instruction actually means?
Yeah, that's a good one, and that's one that seems to be getting used a lot more on VATSIM than it did at least when I started. So the first thing, like Evan said, is if you don't understand something, just ask. Most controllers are more than willing to talk to you about it and help you learn. I mean, at the end of the day, that's why most of us are on VATSIM is to learn. So never hesitate to ask a controller, "Hey, I don't understand what this means. Could you help? Could you clarify?" And most will be more than willing to help you out with that. Um, as far as the question specifically goes, typically, I really this would be a good topic for a future discussion, Evan, if we're talking about like flight planning and stuff like that. But typically, you'll descend at a given Mach number, whatever you were cruising at, maybe, or possibly something else. And as you maintain a constant Mach number, as you descend, your indicated airspeed is going to slowly increase. So when you hit a predetermined indicated airspeed, you'll intercept that and then you'll transition or you'll switch over to using that indicated airspeed. So, for example, for me, the standard profile is Mach 0.74. And then when we reach a point where Mach 0.74 equals 290 knots, we transition to 290 knots and then we maintain 290 knots the rest of the way down. So, what ATC is telling you to do is start descending at whatever your Mach number is, whatever you were filed at. And then when you hit 250 knots, switch to that and maintain 250 knots the rest of the way down. Some airplanes you can program it and let it take care of that for you. Other airplanes it's a little bit more complicated. It just kind of depends on what you're flying as far as how you actually accomplish that.
Perfect. I'm gonna be rude and look away because I'm scrolling through some chat questions on the other computer here, so apologize for being rude for a second. But some good questions coming up on the Pilot Club's YouTube channel. I've noticed, Jared says, I've noticed in MSFS some airliners don't have missed approach procedures built in after setting up the FMC. So there's nothing in there. What do I do if I have to go around?
That's a great question. And this is, interestingly enough, something of a point of contention, even in real life, depending on who you talk to. Everyone seems to have different opinions on this. Um, at a towered airport, especially a large one like you're probably flying airlines to on VATSIM, the overwhelming majority of the time, if you have a missed approach, they're going to provide you with a heading and an altitude. Um, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to fly the published missed approach at Boston, for example. Wow, excuse me. Sorry. With that being said, if they don't give you anything and they tell you to fly the published missed, just ask. Say, hey, we're unable to fly the published missed approach. We'd request a heading and an altitude, something to that end, and they'll be able to issue that. You can also, depending on the type of approach, you can probably fly the missed approach without an FMS. You may be able to fly it with raw data green needles and a VOR or a manual hold or something like that. It increases workload. It's less automated, but that may be an option as well as long as you set up and you prepare for it.
Perfect. Off the Pilot Club's YouTube channel as well, a question from Rich. What happens when you've got maybe conflicting information? So let's say that you're on an ILS, the flight director's commanding that, and now you get a TCAS RA. So, the ILS glide slope is saying, well, you should descend, but the RA is saying you should climb. How do you deal with that type of situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. It really comes down to the priority of different things. So a TCAS RA overrides everything, essentially. There was an accident back in, when was it? The 90s, I want to say, over Germany. I don't know if you remember which one I'm
Yeah.
talking about, Evan.
Yep.
I want to say it was in the 90s, but either way, there was a set of airplanes over Germany. They received a TCAS RA. The controller told one person to climb or maybe it was descend, but either way, one airplane followed the TCAS RA. The other airplane followed the air traffic control instruction, and they either climbed or descended into each other, and they still collided. And so that really, I think that previously this was emphasized, but especially since then, there's been an emphasis on if you receive an RA, you follow that. You don't follow a glide slope. You ignore ATC. It doesn't matter if they call you and they won't leave you alone. You say, we're responding to an RA, we'll call you back. But that RA overrides everything.
Yep. And then, similar story to the situation we had with Creekor at Syracuse, right? In that case where we're deciding to go around, we've had the RA. If at this point, we're now super high, we've got all kinds of conflicting information. We're single pilot, so it's high workload. Like, let's just break off this approach. We can get another vector. We can do that again. We don't have to try to be a hero and, disconnect the autopilot and dive bomb it into the runway, turn it to 50 knots, right? Now, again, if we have the airport in sight, we've got time, we can configure. Sure, maybe we want to try a visual approach, but there's no pressure to do that. Perfectly fine if we just want to get a vector background and try approach again. So that's
Yeah.
good. Matt Bartles really wants to know how you're supposed to drink your coffee while you're hand flying.
It's a skill acquired over time. No, I'm
Okay.
kidding.
Yeah, that'll work. There's some questions about whether or not you have to report waypoints to air traffic control. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, that's a good one. So wow, this is bringing me back to my flight instructor days.
Yeah.
Um, So there are a series of required reports, such as the final approach fix inbound. I forget what regulation that's under. There's a whole list of them,
Hmm.
but generally speaking, you don't need to report waypoints if you've been radar identified. Um, if a controller's told you radar contact, they know where you are, they can see you on the screen or the radar. You don't need to report waypoints unless you're told to. You know, you may hear like report the final approach fix inbound or something like that, but generally that's if you're in a radar environment. The only thing I can think of, honestly, Evan, you can probably speak better to this than I can.
Yeah, so agreed. You've heard radar contact or the ICAO World Radar Identified. At that point, generally, you don't have to report passing because we can see where you are, so you don't need to do that. Now, here's a good one. If you're checking on, this is a VATSIMism, if you're checking on to a new frequency, you haven't been talking to a controller, you were on Unicom, here's a great thing to do that helps your controllers. Tell us where you are. Now, you don't have to do that when you're radar contact, when you're coming from New York Center to Boston Center, then we know. But if you're coming from Unicom and you haven't been talking to a controller, it's super helpful to say, hey, American 615, 20 miles southwest of Kennedy at flight level 270. That information lets me figure out exactly where you are, and I can actually radar identify you right off that. I don't have to ask you to ident or change a code or anything like that because you've told me exactly where you are. So that's a good time where you might want to actually report that. And then a couple other fun ones that I love to just bring up. The FAA's AIM technically says that you're supposed to report anytime that you start descending. Nobody ever does that. It also says that you're supposed to report every time you enter a hold, and everyone does that. So I don't know why we only do one and not the other. But generally speaking, if you're talking to a controller, you've said or heard radar contact, we know where you are. You don't need to report anything. You certainly don't need to report established in the localizer in the United States. But if you're coming to us from a Unicom area or when you're dealing with oceanic procedures that are historically anyway non-radar, there may be some reporting requirements there. So one last question. This one's a tough one, so you can decide how detailed you want to go. Because again, you could write a whole webinar on this one. But how do you decide when to start descending? I mean, sometimes the top of descent seems like it might be too late. Sometimes I've started descending. Now ATC gives me a shortcut, and I'm too high on my vertical path. So any tips or recommendations that you can in a minute or so try to summarize that whole process
Oh
for us? I know
man,
that's a hard one.
yeah, that is. Okay, so there's a few things here. I'll start. It's okay. So it depends a little bit on the airplane. There are different vertical modes. There are different ways of determining, like with a crossing restriction, what speed or what vertical speed you need to make it. Um, Going back to basics, the simple 3-to-1 rule is a pretty foolproof way of doing it. So if you need to descend for every 1,000 foot you need to descend, it takes you about 3 miles to do that. So if you need to descend from 35,000 feet down to 10,000 feet, that's 25 miles. My high school level arithmetic tells me that would, did I say 25 miles?
Yes.
Wow. 25 whew, 25,000 feet, so that would be 75 miles. And then personally I like to add 10 miles to that to give me a bit of a buffer, especially if there's a big tailwind. um, to calculate a rate of descent, take your ground speed, multiply it by 5. So if you're doing 400 knots, 4,000 knots. If you're doing 400 knots, that would be a vertical speed of 2,000 feet per minute, and that'll give you a roughly 3-degree descent angle all the way down. um, but beyond that, honestly, a lot of it just comes down to knowing the airplane, right? Like I know with the CRJ, I can adjust VPA, I can adjust crossing restrictions to be like plus or minus a certain amount of distance. If we have VNAV, that can be useful. Um, a lot of it comes down to knowing the airplane, but that 3-to-1 rule is a really good sanity check. And in the absence of any of those automated systems, that's a great way to do it.
Yeah, and of course, like the departure question earlier, look at the arrival. If there is a specific point that you have to cross, that's a good place to reference. A lot of arrivals might have expected information, right? So it may say expect to cross this waypoint at this altitude. That may not be in your FMS. So plug that waypoint's altitude in, and now you're going to see that your top of descent moves back because it's calculated to actually meet that place. One of the things that I've used in jet flying that's super helpful is just to think, I want to be about 30 to 35 flying miles from the airport. at 10,000 feet above the ground at about 250 knots. If I make it to that point, I can basically fly any approach to any runway and I'll make it to the ground okay. So if you're flying into, sometimes it's actually easier to go into a place like Boston because you've got the RNAV arrival, all the altitudes are there, that's easy. But when you're going to, say, a place like Syracuse and maybe ATC's offline, how the heck do you know when you should start descending, right? So if you plug that point in, if you go, hey, 30 miles from Syracuse, 10,250 knots, if you put that in your FMS and you calculate a descent to that point, you'll find that that's a really easy place to then start the approach from. So that's one of the things that I've always used. And like Creekor says, I mean, there's a lot to that question. So maybe we'll have to put
Yeah.
together some more thoughts on that. Creekor, as we get set to wrap up here, any last comments, thoughts, things as we want to just wrap things up?
Yeah, I appreciate you all taking the time to come out and learn. This all starts with a conversation, and I hope that you found this informative. I appreciate y'all listening to me go on for, I guess, a little over an hour now. And yeah,
Perfect. Well,
thank you,
thank you,
Evan, for
Creekor,
putting all this together.
for a great presentation. Really pleased that you could be part of this, and great comments, great tips, and really the chat was awesome today. So thank you, everyone, whether you're watching with us on VATSIM, VATUSA, with the Pilot Club, listening at Sky Blue Radio, and of course watching through the Flight Sim Association website. Thanks, guys, for participating and making this a really interactive discussion. And if this was interesting to you, please let us know in the chat. Reach me on Discord, send me an email. We're kind of thinking about, do we put together a little bit more of a formal presentation that could be kind of like a series on some of these topics. Like, again, we could do a whole one on descent via, we could do a whole one on departures. So we're thinking about that. We'd love to know what you guys think, if that would be helpful, if you think that pilots on the network would appreciate that, and then maybe even if that would make a difference in terms of the flying that you do. We'd love to hear what you thought about today's session and ideas that you might have for the future. So please send those through to us either now here on the chats, or of course feel free to reach out to me. I think most people know where to find me. I love just chatting with simmers and sort of getting that perspective of what would be helpful for you guys. And a friendly reminder as well, again, if you'd like to support us here at the association, what we'd love to get from you is sign up, become a member. It's totally free to join at flightsimassociation.com. If you really want to support and you really enjoyed today's presentation, you can become a captain for $3 a month. That stuff goes right back to running the website. It helps us get set for our next Flight Sim Expo, wherever or whenever that's going to be, with some maybe news coming up on that in the next little while here. And beyond that, you get access to preferred pricing at more than 40 different flight simulation vendors and special perks, including access to our Discord, all kinds of good stuff. So again, big thanks to those Flight Sim Association captains, to everyone for watching in the chat, to VATSIM, VATUSA, the Pilot Club, Boston Virtual Air, TCC, and Sky Blue Radio for helping us make this possible. To Creekor, to you, that'll be it from us. Thank you again, everyone, and good night.